Hello, ladies. I'm very excited to be here and to share a little bit about my family and our homeschool journey. Now that it's over and I'm officially retired, I can look back on more than 20 years of teaching my kids and share some of my hard-earned wisdom, as well as wisdom that was graciously passed on to me early in my adventures that helped me avoid a lot of frustration. And I pray I can do the same and encourage you and hopefully give each of you some confidence and also offer some practical suggestions, regardless of where you are in your homeschool journey. My name is Michelle Shaff, and some of you may recognize me as a Creation Gospel trainer if you've studied Dr. Elwine's Workbook 1 online in the last year. And Sydney, here at the Rooted Cafe, was in our last session and heard me teaching a class where I shared a bit about my homeschool methods and that I tend to try my best to plan the end from the beginning. And she contacted me and asked me if I'd like to speak to you at this conference about that very thing. So I thought that should be my opening story. So if you're not familiar with me, it will give you a taste of how my mind works. If you printed off my notes, you should have my rough outline of the key points I'm making on the left side. And then the right side is blank, so you can jot down anything that speaks to your heart without worrying that you're missing the main ideas. So if you are anywhere near the beginning of your homeschool journey, or even near the end, and a bit panicked about the thought of schooling all the way to graduation, I hope these pictures offer a lot of encouragement. When my husband and I finally decided we were going to homeschool, one of the first things I did, aside from reading a lot of books, was attend our state homeschool convention. Several of my friends went into the vendor hall to immediately look at curriculum. Well, I went into the vendor hall to speak to the college representatives that were there to recruit homeschoolers. So what's funny about that story, my kids were 5, 4, and 2 years old at the time, very near the ages in the picture on the left. When the college reps asked for the ages of my kids, as you might expect, there was some chuckling. But the principle still stands. Having some kind of idea about your end goals is critical in my mind. First, I wanted to make sure I wasn't going to mess up anything along the way that might prevent my kids from getting into college, if that's what they chose to do. So sure, I was met with laughter from the reps when they told me I had a little bit of time to figure things out. To which I replied, yeah, I get it. But the second reason I wanted to start with the colleges was to know what was so special about the homeschoolers, that the colleges themselves would take the time and expense to send representatives to the convention and try to recruit them. I wanted to know what was so special from their perspective. Well, that got their attention, and the answers along the entire row of colleges at that convention were consistent. They told me 3 things they loved about homeschoolers. They said they're good students, they know how to study, which is often related to being a good student, but it is a separate skill that must be learned. And most important, they said, they love to learn. Across the board at each of the representatives' booths, the homeschoolers they encountered, they said they didn't have to remind them when things were due, and they didn't have to be spoon-fed through their classes because they saw that they just genuinely loved to learn. My oldest daughter, who's in the middle in these pictures, graduated magna cum laude. My middle daughter, on the farthest end on the inside, graduated summa cum laude. And my son on the nearest end will be a senior in college this fall. And so far, he has a 3.8 GPA. So he's not nearly as motivated as my daughters, but we see that he's managing to keep his GPA in the honors range. But either way, he's doing just fine. And I don't take credit for their hard work. If anything, I just took my cue from the college recruiters and worked really hard to ignite their love of learning, which made my job so much easier. So if we spend just a few moments on each of the points the recruiters told me they loved about homeschoolers, as I reflected on our journey, I could easily see where I sort of broke them into categories. Of course, we want to start with the early years and capitalize on their eagerness to learn, their little minds that just soak up information. So that's an easy place to encourage their love of learning. And as we move into the middle school years, well, that's the place to focus on helping them be good students. The love of learning doesn't stop, of course, but now they have some maturity and they can take that love and start to figure out their natural gifts and interests. And then, of course, by the time they enter high school, well, now they really need to understand how to study and begin to incorporate those planning skills into their love of learning and grow even more as a good student. So that all looks nice and clean on a slide, right? And I will return to talk about each of these stages in our journey, but I want to take a detour first. Because you and I both know that it's never that clean and easy. What we envision working out on paper, in theory, is often a far cry from what happens in practice. Real life tends to paint outside our carefully drawn margins. And if you're a planner like I am, that can be a recipe for frustration. I don't know about you, but I started my homeschool journey basically bringing my public education home. That's all I knew, so that's what I did. I had the kids sitting in desks, and I had a whiteboard. I even had a bulletin board with a calendar and various things we were studying stapled to it. Now, I'm not sure that lasted more than a few months, but that also made me feel like a failure. And I wasn't sure really what my homeschool should look like. And even if you're not a planner by nature, chaos tends to frustrate most people. So I just want to take a few minutes and be honest with you. I don't know if anyone listening to this conference struggles with doubt, but I did. Even though I chose to stay home and pour into my kids, I often felt less than by society standards. People would ask me what I did, and I would always answer the same way. Oh, I'm just a homeschool mom. As if my job wasn't nearly as important as those I stood before. The people with a real job. After all, how can staying home with my kids be considered a real job? I mean, how important is that? At least that was the lie that I believed. I pray that is not what any of you think, but I had to wrestle with those thoughts for a lot longer than I'd like to admit. And it went well beyond trying to figure out where my kids should sit every day for class time and what my homeschool room should look like. Can I just say, I am so glad the majority of my homeschooling was well before Pinterest was a thing. I cannot imagine trying to live up to some of those standards. And I hope you don't have to. The thing that finally helped me overcome those nagging doubts that I should be out there working a real job and leave the education of my kids to the so-called professionals was sitting down and truly putting words to my goals, praying for direction and guidance for myself, for my family, and especially for my kids. If this is the job I was created for, then I needed to have a clearly defined vision so I could complete the mission. So let me ask you, why are you homeschooling? Have you ever thought about your convictions and the target you're aiming for? I know when I began, I didn't have a clue. I just knew that the district we lived in at the time was terrible, and I was not sending my kids there. But as I sorted out my reasons, I found that once I became clear in what I wanted and what I expected, those boundaries just made my life easier and the kids as well. I no longer thought about putting them on the school bus and looking for a job outside the home. And I also realized that the so-called standards of society were a far cry from God's standards. So don't worry about Pinterest and having the perfect schoolroom. Look at God's word and search inward for your family's calling. I have included a mind map in the worksheets for this talk. You can see the first page of it on the left. So if you just think of it as a template to help you process some of your goals and even some of your doubts and work through what you would ultimately like your homeschool to look like. Now, the worksheet may not seem like much, but it helped me immensely. Often, we just need some space to process our thoughts and some boundaries and parameters to walk within. When we don't know what we're aiming for, how can we expect to hit the target? The beauty of homeschooling, you get to define your target. For example, I'll share the mission or vision statement that I ultimately came up with that ended up sticking throughout our high school years. I said, we homeschool to build a strong sense of identity in Yeshua, nourish our relationships, and tailor our education to create a wholly unique and solid foundation upon which to build as God sees fit. This certainly wasn't my original statement in our early years. We grew into this vision as we matured and found our footing. And once you figure out your main objectives, you may change and alter your statement as you grow and your goals change. But it helped to remind me of the bigger picture, especially when the days were hard. I was never more nervous than the high school years. And it was such a time of transition and so many changes that having this simple statement helped keep me anchored. So that's one example that helped me solidify my convictions and our family goals. And I actually created a planner, and every year I always put this somewhere in it so I could easily find it and read it often to keep our goals in focus. It's amazing how fast time really does fly, and we want to make each day count in our homeschool journey. Because ultimately, every homeschool is different, or it should be, and we do have a limited time with our kids under our roof. God has uniquely made each and every one of us. So, armed with my vision, I began to learn to tailor our homeschool to each of my kids. If we think in terms of a greenhouse, our kids are the plants we're growing. But in the end, we know they can't stay in the greenhouse forever. Eventually, we want them to survive outside of the sheltered environment. Because I wanted to work myself out of a job, and I assume you do too. We all want our children to follow the Lord and lead productive and purposeful lives. So if we have that goal in mind, we now have some direction. Of course, we still have to learn about each plant or child, because believe me, even though I had 3 kids in 3 years, they were all very different in personality, learning styles, and giftings. But the beauty of homeschooling, your kids are not in a typical greenhouse or classroom environment with 30 other kids inside a school with hundreds of other kids, all being measured by the same standards, right? So you can take the time to cultivate and tend to each of their particular conditions and tailor their education in a way that they thrive and grow. My middle daughter, Emma, loves plants. She's told me some fascinating things about some of her favorites. For instance, some plants require daily watering. Other plants, of course, are fussy about sunlight. And still others require almost no maintenance. They prefer to be left alone and watered sparingly. Each plant has different care that's required. And guess what? So do your kids. And it's our job to figure out their needs and respect their unique beauty. Okay, I promise I didn't forget the categories that the college reps shared with me. I just wanted to lay some groundwork first. Of course, I want to be encouraging and helpful, but it's too easy to gloss over struggles, and I didn't want to do that. So now that you have some background, let's circle back and I'll share some of our strategies that helped me, starting with inspiring a love of learning in the early years. My number one goal in those early years was to make sure they loved to learn. And I found for our family that if I followed my kids' natural curiosity, the learning basically took care of itself. Now, that's both good and bad news, depending on your teaching style. I like to have a plan and some structure, but I quickly learned that things went so much smoother if I followed their lead. Now, I don't mean I threw out structure, but I allowed my plans to be shifted and actually learned to stop and talk about why the butterfly was landing on the flower, if that happened to catch their eye. Look for those teachable moments when they see something fascinating that we often take for granted. As their questions come bubbling up, engage them. When we think about those things through their eyes, it truly helps reprioritize and see things again for the first time. God's design is amazing, and often I think we are just so desensitized to His beauty and the lessons He puts before us on a daily basis. I don't know about you, but I struggle sometimes with too many things on my plate. And if I'm honest, a lot of useless distractions. Kids definitely demand our time and attention, and that too is by design. I often think I learned so much more from my kids than I actually taught them, simply because they wouldn't take no for an answer. So don't be afraid to follow their lead. One speaker I heard years ago at a convention spoke about Proverbs 22:6. Train up a child in the way he should go, and even when he grows older, he will not abandon it. And she took that quite literally and trained her kids in their natural interests, their giftings. And she had very successful children, she said, largely as a result of that decision. So, for instance, if your child is math-minded, don't stress so much over making him or her into a great writer. Sure, they need the basics, but focus on their strengths more than their weaknesses. And also, if I may just say it, another way to find their interest is to shut the screens off and just let them play. From my husband's perspective, he would often say the one benefit he could readily see about homeschooling was that our kids had their childhood back. I think we often underestimate the value of free time. I can honestly say I don't ever recall our kids telling me they were bored. They could play for hours with a cardboard box, scissors, and a few crayons or markers. Their imagination was all they needed. They also learned to work together and be content with what they had. And along the same lines, another discipline we created after my kids outgrew naps was every afternoon we all spent 1 hour alone, usually in our rooms where it was quiet, and I just called it room time. After all, we spent a lot of time together, and after lunch, our brains were full and our patience was gone, so it was also nice to enjoy some solitude and time to process our thoughts. And some days, even as they got older, a nap was still necessary. So having that time each day was a welcome reprieve. And after being refreshed from room time, another thing we looked forward to each day was reading out loud. It's also another way to explore various interests. I can't stress reading enough. It doesn't even matter their ages. I read out loud to myself when my oldest was in utero, and every day after she was born. And then, of course, as each new child came along, we just kept reading. Even now, if we're going on a long road trip as a family, my kids still want me to read out loud to them, and my husband enjoys it too. It makes the long hours in the van easier to handle, and reading aloud in general helps sharpen our listening skills. So find good books and enjoy leisurely afternoons on the couch or outside on a blanket and just read. I tell people if I did anything right in our homeschool, I created 3 voracious readers. And that may be the single biggest factor in their success at college, simply that they are all very well read. Each of my kids have kept a log of all the books they've read since they could read meaningful chapter books, beyond See Spot Run, probably starting their list in earnest around the 3rd grade, so about 8 years old. My oldest is now 22, and she's read over 700 books. That's an average of about 50 books a year, or almost 1 book a week. And my other 2 are right in line with that average as well. I just happen to know Olivia's book total because she mentioned it the other week when she passed 700 books. And that doesn't include all the books I read aloud to them. Reading helps increase their vocabulary, their comprehension. It opens their minds to other worlds and increases their empathy, allowing them to live vicariously through others' trials and accomplishments that they might not otherwise ever experience. I had them keep their book logs simply because I couldn't keep up with their reading. I required them to read a classic or a nonfiction book after every what we called fluffy fiction book. So that way, I didn't have to limit them. I just tried to keep balance and a well-rounded reading list. The only downside, since we all love reading, our book budget can get out of hand if we're not careful. So make use of your local library. I know we did. So I also included in your notes a few links to help you get started finding good books that are age appropriate to read to your kids. Most are part of curriculum packages, so the catalogs work double duty as they are also a nice way to familiarize yourself with various methods of teaching. I was sort of a curriculum junkie and usually couldn't handle buying everything in one box from one company for one grade level. So I often mixed and matched and used the book lists to incorporate good literature selections with our schooling. But the resources I listed are tremendously helpful. Even ordering their catalogs alone will help you, especially if you are new to homeschooling or just looking to refresh some of your curriculum. And that always brings to mind something I heard at the beginning of our journey. The curriculum is just a tool. If it's not working, find a better tool. Because if we move on and focus on becoming good students, it's always about relationship over the curriculum. In the long run, keeping curriculum because we spend a lot of money on it really doesn't pay when we sacrifice our peace and our sanity with our kids. Being a good student is often far more than being able to understand and pass tests. For our family, being a good student was basically just working on being a good person. And the middle school years are a good age for great discussion and greater understanding of what we've likely been demonstrating and teaching them from birth. So at this point, they are becoming more responsible. They can better assess their own needs and take care of things without constant supervision. They're becoming their own person, figuring out life. So I found this a good time to just give them some space. Again, if we ultimately want to work ourselves out of a job, our kids need to be able to teach themselves and function on their own. Of course, we're still there, coming alongside for guidance, but let them struggle a bit or come to you with their questions. We don't always have to rescue them. If we go back to our greenhouse analogy, now we're starting to expose them to a little more of the elements. Wind, rain, a little more sunlight, and we see how they handle it. Often it was at this age that they started wanting more space and greater responsibility. They started to ask, for the extra wind, so to speak. They can handle watering themselves a bit, right? So again, follow their lead. You know your kids better than anyone, and they certainly know you. Open and honest dialogue is key. We actually started implementing what we called monthly meetings at this point, sort of like our own internal assessment and expectations. We would share with each other, and we called it Shaff family information, meaning it wasn't meant to leave that meeting. It was just a chance to sit down and share honestly with some things we were struggling with, challenges maybe, things that were coming up on the calendar, things we might have to work around. You get the idea. It was basically a planning meeting, so we could all lend a hand in areas that we knew were going to be challenging or even exciting, maybe an upcoming vacation. We would discuss the areas we all wanted to visit. Meetings don't have to be bad and torturous. We usually provided some kind of a sweet snack and a drink, and we just openly planned our next month. Again, if we set the expectations, planning the month in advance, it just helped things run more smoothly. Now, that didn't mean it was rainbows and butterflies. Be prepared that in the process, there may be some mistakes made and a lot of messes to clean up. I distinctly remember teaching my kids to cook. They loved to help me in the kitchen when they were little, and I remember Olivia was in the 5th grade, and she told me, "Mommy, I want to learn to cook well so you can retire." And I thought, well, that sounded like a fabulous idea. So I began to follow that interest, and anything Olivia wanted to do, Emma was close behind. So I bought the girls their own set of bakeware and cookbooks. They already had the basic understanding because in the early years, I had assigned each kid a night to be my helper in the kitchen. So as they were older and more responsible, I just gave them the tools and I walked away. I knew they needed to figure things out on their own, and my constant hovering only made things more stressful for them and for me. One thing I didn't do that I wish I would have, I never really taught them how to clean up as you go, because I left them to figure some things out on their own. And cleaning up, as you might guess, wasn't a top priority. Oh my goodness, my girls can both cook and bake, but I think it's a goal for them to see how many things they can get dirty in the process. Dishes are a nightmare after they've spent time in the kitchen. But let me tell you, they can create meals I never would have thought of. They even cooked for a solid 2 years, each taking a week at a time and planning meals, budgeting the groceries. I made that a class and put it on their high school transcript. But if I had micromanaged them, I'm not sure they would have developed their own style. I'm not even sure they would have enjoyed cooking. So that's sort of a cautionary tale. You have to take the good with the bad. And I even required Luke to learn a handful of basic meals. He doesn't enjoy cooking. He says he only likes to eat, but he will not starve because he too can find his way around the kitchen. But I'm sure you'll figure out the best methods for your family, and cooking is just one illustration. As you extend grace and allow them to grow in their independence, they will all find their individual needs and interests. And another way to create good students is by letting your kids serve others. We often learn best when we teach. So let your kids serve their younger siblings or work with older friends and family, those in need. Lord knows we need wisdom, and I tried my best to put my kids in situations where they could learn from others. We would visit the local nursing home every month and play games with the residents. The conversations we had were priceless. We took meals to friends who were sick, and we helped them out with their household chores. We also had daily chores around our house, and we never gave an allowance. My husband and I made a conscious decision to leave the money aspect out of the equation. Some things in life have to be done, and they don't always come with instant, tangible rewards. Being part of a family means we have to learn to serve each other. Some days, serving others was our school. Life happens, and we didn't always get everything done we thought we needed to, at least on paper. But remember to watch those expectations and set reasonable goals, because in the end, experiences often teach us better and in more lasting ways than any curriculum. And remember, if you were in public school, how many textbooks did you actually finish? I don't know about you, but I can't recall a single one that we studied cover to cover. Which moves us right on to how to study, which largely comes into focus in the high school years. I mean, honestly, it was at this point where I was largely hands-off. Of course, I managed their grades and their transcripts. They had parameters and classes that were required to fulfill state standards, but all the years I spent teaching them to love learning and to be a good student sort of fell into place naturally by the time they entered high school. I asked my kids to choose their curriculum based on the requirements and their interests. After that, I created a planner and loosely set out the weekly agenda, but they filled it in and they determined their pace, and I didn't micromanage their days. All assignments were due on Friday by noon. They quickly learned that if they worked ahead, they had more free time. And by their sophomore year, they also had jobs and they were taking classes at the college. So their time was split between home, campus, and work. So in all reality, there was no way I could manage all their schedules and classes, nor did I want to. Because if we return once again to the greenhouse, it's at this point that they should be able to completely stand on their own. If we've been training and guiding them from the beginning with this goal in mind, their roots should be nice and deep and firmly planted. We started our homeschool journey with an idea of what we wanted to achieve by the end. Now, did I know exactly what that would look like? Of course not. But I kept our mission statement close, and I often modified it, and I hope you sit down to create your own and pray over it, because knowing the end from the beginning helps so much to keep our eyes focused on the big picture. We want our children to bear good fruit. Hopefully, we modeled that for them as they were growing up, and they have an idea of what that looks like. But really, at this point, it's time to shift the focus and let them develop to maturity. Our homeschool scripture verse was Isaiah 61:3. So they will be called oaks of righteousness, the planting of the Lord, that he may be glorified. So yes, it can be difficult to let our kids grow up. I know it's natural to worry and wonder if we've done enough. I still look back and think of things I would change if I had it to do over again. But you know what? Even if I could, you and I both know I would still not be perfect. Our family would still make mistakes, and we would still have regrets. I often would pray that the Father would just fill in the gaps in all the ways I didn't quite measure up. We all know that He is faithful, and our kids are really His kids. He has a plan for them. We do our best, but He plants them, and eventually the tree itself matures to produce its own fruit. That is the goal and the design. So I trust in His design, and I pray that you do too. Because I want to encourage anyone that still may be on the fence about homeschooling, or maybe some of you are just doubting your calling. I created my website because I was asked to for a different occasion, but as the Lord often does, I already had this idea marinating in my heart and in my journals. What would it look like to affect generations to come? Because that is the seed's potential. I thought of the image floating around the internet of the baby inside the womb and how that child has within her the next generation. So, in effect, my grandma carried her future grandchild, me, when she was pregnant with my mom. Or my mom carried Olivia, Emma, and Luke within her as she carried me. So, seeds within seeds. To think that I carried the potential seeds of my grandchildren that I don't even know yet when I carried my girls, because yes, it's the woman that sows seeds, if you're familiar with the Torah portion, Tazria, and Leviticus 12 through 15. When I studied that for the first time, my mind was blown. Have you ever considered how important you really are for future generations? I know I didn't. That picture on the left was painted by my friend who wants to remain anonymous. He says it's a work of the Holy Spirit and not his, so he wants to be known only as the Red Door Doc. He's a retired OBGYN. When I saw it and read the scripture that he paired with the image, Isaiah 44, 2 through 4, that says, "Thus says the Lord who made you and formed you from the womb, who will help you. Do not fear, O Jacob, my servant, and you, Yeshurun, whom I have chosen. For I will pour out water on the thirsty land and streams on the dry ground. I will pour out my spirit onto your offspring," or seed, "and my blessing on your descendants, and they will spring up among the grass like poplars by streams of water." I immediately printed it and hung it on my wall. It spoke so much to my heart. Inside the womb of water, there is a closed mem. Hebrew is fascinating, and a closed mem can represent a barren or virgin womb. And there is a lot of teachings on that subject, so I won't pretend to know all the implications. There's also so much to ponder in this painting. I love to look at it and find new layers of meaning. Even the artist, being a retired OBGYN, said when he was painting it, he only thought it was about watering and protecting the seed. It was only after he was done and he stepped back that he realized the water could represent a womb. And he had no idea that was a Hebrew letter that he painted inside of it. I find that fascinating. But it's on my website, as well as new paintings that he paints every week. He graciously lets me put them on my website, and I always look forward to what the Lord is speaking to him through his art. So that's how I arrived at Seeds Within Seeds. And as I reflect on my homeschool journey, I was sowing seeds, sowing my children and potential future grandchildren into the world, cultivating, tending, and watering those seeds that I was carefully sowing in them, tending to their hearts, taking the time to invest in them as a kingdom investment. Sure, I'm not going to lie, it often felt like I was giving up something. But as perspective often does, looking back, I see it wasn't a sacrifice at all. It was actually the biggest blessing of my life, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. And as I pondered this painting further, I can see how we need to protect the next generation and their seed. And at the same time, we need to protect the seed, the word, because they are both at risk and under attack in the times we are living. My hope is to affect that generational legacy. At least I hope to do so in my family. And if it speaks to you, all the better, right? The ripple effect of the seed. And we are all sowing seeds. So part of the reason we chose to homeschool in the first place was to change some of the generational patterns both my husband and I saw in each other and in our families. We don't have to keep repeating things that are no longer working. Inside the seed is the potential for fruit and, of course, more seeds. If we quit trying to modify the seed and instead start focusing on cultivating better soil and the conditions for the seed to grow, we can trust His design and His word. It will not return void. That is my prayer with homeschooling, with families, and people in general, that we stop repeating the same generational mistakes over and over, and instead we start to learn and to heal. Maybe that's a lofty dream, but I believe that homeschooling can be the place to begin the restoration. So take it from a retired homeschool mom who often thought I was just a homeschool mom. Let me tell you, there is no such thing. So let me ask you, is this just an egg? Can you see the end from the beginning? The potential is there. God's design is already at work. You instinctually know how to nurture your kids and tailor to their needs. You are created for this. You are uniquely equipped for this job. You know your kids' potential, and I know you can see it. So let me ask you another question. Are you just a homeschool mom? Think of all you do in a typical day, a week, a year. Now think about 18 years. There is no way in the world the school system can replicate you and the time and devotion spent with your children. And I am not in any way putting down public school teachers. 3 of my closest friends are teachers, and 2 of them quit to homeschool their kids. And the third is considering it as her oldest nears kindergarten age. They all know the battle of the classroom, and they know there is no comparison. So as I look back over the years, I can see my role in a whole new light. I had to overcome a lot of doubt from family and friends, not to mention self-doubt, when we decided to homeschool. It was a huge leap of faith, and I often thought I was failing as a mom and a teacher. But that's only because I couldn't see all the way to the end. So let me encourage you. You have everything you need to be successful. As they say, when the days are long, remember, the years are short. Trust the process and just keep going. The end is also right there in the beginning. And the beginning is in the end, if you have eyes to see it. The ripple effect of the seed continues. Thank you for letting me share a bit of our journey with you. I pray it is a blessing and an encouragement.